G'day and welcome to the Sifter Showcase. We're going to take a bit of a tactical look now. We're going to think about strategy. We're talking about a game called Spies and Soldiers. And joining me is Jim Batt, who is one of the part of the team. A couple of people who work on that team, including Jim's brother, Ben. Jim, thanks for joining us on the Sifter Showcase.
No worries, glad to be here.
Now, tell us a little bit more about your game, which you talk pretty openly having sort of board game roots and sort of a digital board game feel, Spies and Soldiers. What is it and how does it play?
Yeah, so Spies and Soldiers is procedurally generated turn-based strategy game. Our focus has been very much on having sort of simple mechanics from which you get like complex strategies. So that's coming from that board game background. I think games like the Game of Thrones board game is probably a big touchstone for us. That was one of our inspirations early on. And it's just getting that kind of tactical gameplay where you're kind of going head to head with another person and tussling it out. The procedurally generated side of it is something that we're quite excited by. It's like, so every time you play, it's on a different map, which makes for that very different kind of strategies at the start of each game, which is good. In terms of the theme, it's kind of a low fantasy theme, so there's no magic or anything, sort of medieval setting, and you play as sort of a shadowy advisor or tactician, putting your claimant on the throne. So at the start of the game, you'll select which person you think has got the best shot at being able to rule the empire. And it's a 1v1 multiplayer game at the moment. We're working on more of a single player campaign. It won't be so much a narrative driven one, but we're leaning into that procedurally generated side of things again. So each time you play through the campaign, we'll be generating different maps that you kind of work your way through. Playing those single player campaigns will unlock more elements for the multiplayer game. So we sort of see that you would kind of practice on the single player, get your skills up, unlock more banners and different abilities, and then bring those over to the multiplayer. And yeah, it's asynchronous too. So one of the cool things about it is that because it's turn-based, but it's simultaneous turns, which means that we can do asynchronous play really well. So that was one of the things that I think playing a lot of board games online, it's like this tricky thing where you're trying to line up your friends to play at the same time, but it's a turn-based game. So it always seemed like a natural fit to be able to have that work as a notification system. So how that works is that basically when you take your turn, if the other player isn't online, it'll just send them a Steam notification or an email notification, and then they can just take their turn in their own time. But because it's the simultaneous turns, if the other player is online and you're playing at the same time, the turns actually crack through pretty quickly because you're both making your decisions at the same time. So it has this really nice sort of scaling effect where if you go from like, oh, I'll just start this game, and then as it starts to get a bit tense and someone like is jumping back in to check their turn quite quickly, you can actually end up with it being quite fast paced. So that was one of the things is we didn't want it to like blow out and get too long games, because it's like the idea is it's a fast paced sort of thing. So a game probably takes around 45 minutes.
That play by email sort of mode it's like having a bit of a moment at the moment. Like, I remember it being a mainstay of the very early online play, and because that was really the only way you couldn't play synchronous online multiplayer. It just didn't work in the 56k modem era, but it's now really coming back. So that's a really interesting way to sort of put that all together. In terms of like how you actually manage the game, I know there's two major sort of the spies and the soldiers, and that's kind of how you're either doing subterfuge or you're actually doing sort of combat. But is there a resources in this game? Because is it something like a civilization where dependent on the map that you're on, your strategy is going to be dependent on what resources you have around? How does that all work?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like it very much does, as the name says, which is the gameplay is about spies and about soldiers, and they're the two sort of main layers. One thing that I think that's quite different about our game from a lot of other strategy games is that we don't have a lot of upgrade trees or like unit types. And we also don't really have, like, it's not like a 4X style thing where you're constantly building new locations around the map. So it's very much about using the soldiers, the spies, and then they're each corresponding to a location type, which is a city or a castle. So they're the main kind of core gameplay things. But then underneath that is a layer of terrain. So that's where you get a lot of variety from the maps. So there's mountains. Currently, there's mountains, forests, and farmland. We're going to try. One of the plans with this game is that we want to have more expansions and stuff coming out. So sort of rolling updates in the future, if it all goes well. And so being able to add in more terrain types without changing the core game layer is part of the design. It's very modular, like in a similar way to a board game where you have like these sort of modular designs where you can add in extra elements. But yeah, so the resources side of it is, to give you a little bit of an overview of how the spies and the soldiers work themselves. Basically, the soldiers allow you to take area control. So they'll take control of regions and they'll take control of castles. Castles give you the victory points that you need to win the game. In a classic board game kind of thing, it's like the first person to get 5 victory points and hold them, those 5 castles, that will win you the game. But then the spy layer is the spies will take the cities that give you the action points that you need to give orders. So the main kind of resource economy is sending out your spies to get control of these cities that will give you enough extra things you can do in each turn with your action points. The spy world is very paranoid, basically, because each spy can be ranked up, so you can upgrade them in cities. But that means because they can only see other spies of of a lower rank, so that means that you have this thing where you're never quite sure if you've got the biggest spy around. They can actually be ranked up infinitely. So even if you've built like a big 5-level spy and you're like, I'm pretty sure I've got the master spy, you're never quite sure. So the spies are kind of moving around in sort of shadowy world, taking control of the cities, assassinating each other out of the dark. But they also interact with the combat in the way that the combat is very simple. It's just like whoever has the highest combat strength. So if you both move into a region, it's whoever has the most soldiers. Each soldier gives you 1 combat strength. We're very determined to not have any random dice rolls or anything like that. So it's very deterministic combat. You always know, like, okay, I go in here, I've got more soldiers, I'll win this battle. However, if it's a tie, so if you've got equal forces, then it'll go to a tiebreaker. And the first tiebreaker is, does someone have a spy in the region? Because they're giving you sort of a tactical advantage, some inside information. And so then it's like whoever has the highest rank spy. So suddenly you have these spies marching around or moving into these situations to try and like turn the tide of battle. And that really, it's really interesting how that like one little unpredictable element coming from this sort of paranoid spy layer means that you're just always not quite sure if you're going to win this battle. So you're always like, I'll make sure I send in enough guys that I'm definitely like have the upper hand.
Does that come at a cost of, if you're moving your spies around the area, they're not able to complete tasks in cities as well? Is that kind of like all of that?
Yeah, so there's definitely a thing where you're like, oh, I want to leave this guy here and be upgrading them to make sure. I think I've seen their bigger spies coming to take this city off me. I really want to upgrade this spy here, but I know that I should move them into this neighboring region to support that battle that is pretty critical and that kind of thing. One of the earlier design shifts we had is that originally it was very punitive. The combat was like, you basically would lose the difference, so it would be like you take a lot of casualties. But we realized that made people quite cautious and slowed the game down a lot. So we've now made it so that if you lose a battle, you just take 1 casualty. For the most part, you might take more if you're in a forest and a smaller unit is like retreating away from you. They can set like ambushes and stuff, which is kind of fun. But yeah, it meant that now you just take 1 casualty and you'll retreat unless you're entirely surrounded. So that made people a bit more like happy because there's not like that. Like, well, let's take a crack at it and see how it goes. And now it's kind of like, okay, well, at least I didn't like lose my entire army in that battle.
This game obviously shares a lot with board games, and I'm just wondering, how did you prototype this game? Did you actually do it on, pen and paper drawn out with tiles?
It's interesting. Yeah, the very start of the game, we never did the paper prototype. I've done a bit of board game design myself, and I really think, at that point, if I'm actually designing a board game, I want to get it on the table as quickly as possible. So I think like the scrappier paper thing, just make it on some note cards or whatever. But I find with video games that it leads me towards a more static kind of design. So when we designed this one, we actually did, my brother and I wanted to do a strategy game together. We got together and did our own sort of like game jam, effectively. We just locked ourselves in his house for a weekend and put together a prototype just using like pretty random assets that we could pull in. And so we actually had it going pretty quickly. I think the thing is that the things we would have prototyped on the table would have been sort of fairly standard stuff that we know from board games anyway, in terms of like, oh, this is how combat's going to work or movement. So we didn't have a lot of unknowns there. But the bit that we did really want to try out was the thing that we can't do on a table, which is like the visibility for the spies, all of that kind of layer. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of digital board games, if you play Tabletop Simulator or there's a lot of online versions now, it's like it's great, but I often feel like I'm really missing out on something. It's like it really just wants to be on a table, and I'm not getting a lot more from playing it digitally. Whereas we really wanted to make something where it was like you couldn't directly port this to a tabletop, like it wouldn't work. And so one of the elements there was basically having this hidden information layer, and that would have been very hard to test out as a paper prototype, I think. So we actually managed to get a very early version of this running on that first weekend. It's now taken us a long time to actually get all of it working. But yeah, it came together pretty quickly, just that core concept of like how the spies work, how the soldiers work. We've obviously refined a lot of it since then. And the procedurally generated side of it also was one of the things that, the map generator was like, making a game with a cool map generator was kind of one of the fun things early on. And that's got a really good response. Like a lot of people are just like, I don't even really care about strategy games, but I love maps. I really want to like check out the random map generator.
I can really see actually people enjoying looking at the maps for, fancy tabletop role playing.
Exactly. We're like, yeah. We should just put up a map generator version. I think the ability to export the games we've played.
It's probably not a bad idea. The plan for the game was it was supposed to come out a little bit later this year, but it's going to be a little bit further for people. But where can people find out more information if they want to keep in touch with Spies and Soldiers?
Yeah, so you can check out our Twitter, which is ghostbat_games for kind of game dev updates there. We've got a Discord, which you can find on our webpage, which is spiesandsoldiers.com. And we have a Steam page too, which has got a demo of the game, which pretty much is fully featured at this point. And yeah, as you were saying, we've pushed back our release a little bit because we want to focus on getting a single player game in there a bit more. And that's been something that people have really asked for. So we'll be working on that and hopefully early access sometime early next year.
Jim, it's been a real pleasure. Can't wait to challenge my brother to this, to play over email, because we're big tabletop and board game fans as well. So something that we can play asynchronously is very valuable to us. I appreciate you coming on and telling us a little bit more about Spies and Soldiers for the Sifter Showcase.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.